All right, we're at the top of the
Okay.
hour.
All right.
Speaker's choice,
Um,
how to do the opening and close.
I think I'm gonna do a prayer because I haven't got a brain to do anything else. So,
Okay.
uh, Mother, Father, God, Creator, Divine Mother, watch over us in this heat, in this time of trials and hopefully not too many errors. Give us all the strength to be the best person we can be. Guide us if we stray, because we are human and we do stray. Watch over us throughout the weeks and keep us all safe. I hope. Okay, and the third agreement is don't make assumptions, which we all do. I think probably for human beings, the most delicate time when you make assumptions is when you think you fall in love and you think that person's going to change because they love you. And I learned with my first marriage that ain't never going to happen, girl. It was a stupid assumption, but we do it. Um, we see what we want to see, we hear what we want to hear, and then when something snaps us, um, we go, "Oh, well, it must be his fault because he wouldn't change because he didn't love me enough." No, it just you made a bad choice. I did that with a man I almost married. Uh, he could, he was a chameleon. He could turn himself into anything that anybody he thought anybody wanted until he got you stuck in his web. What saved me was his little boy, who we used to call Dumb Danny. I came home from work one day and I had electric heat, which is extremely expensive, and they had to heat up to 90, and they were all running around in their underwear. And I had a fit, and little Danny said, "Dad doesn't care. He's not paying the bills." That was my wake up call. He was out of my house the next week. It's like, no, man, bad assumption there, girl. But, to give myself credit, uh, he was good at convincing people that he was just wonderful. But he wasn't. He was a user. Um, so I think he says it's very interesting how the human mind works. We have the need to justify everything, which I just did, to explain and understand everything in order to feel safe. Um, and I think a lot of it is we were not, at least my generation was not brought up to question anything. If you questioned your parents, you got the hiding of your life and you never asked a question again. So we weren't encouraged to ask questions or clarify. I had to learn that. And it was a tough lesson because making an assumption was easier, faster, something I had already done. But uh, being able to say to another human being and use those words, could you clarify that statement for me? Did you really mean that? Um, which I think, Miss B, you are really good at that, if I remember correctly from our classes.
It's a
Um,
learned skill.
it is definitely. It's not something we get from birth. Or even things like, I really think I can do this. And then you find out you can't, and then you beat yourself up. Um, I think some of it is, he says it's lying to ourselves. I'd like to find a better word. Hi, Caitlin. Um, I think, we're just so afraid to show who we really are. Because as a child, I always asked why, and it drove my parents nuts. And it was just a simple question, but it would send my father into a rage, and I would always pay a price. So by the time I was about 11, I learned not to ask that word. Um, but as a nurse, I brought that back because I had to know why my patients were sick, why they were throwing up, why this was going on, why that was going on. Um, and a lot of nurses got upset with that because they were brought up the same way I was. You don't ask why. Well, yeah, I do. Sorry. Get over it. That's who I am. But it helped me be a better nurse. It helped my patients stay alive longer. And eventually the doctors would listen to me because they knew when Paula asks why, there's a reason. And some of the other nurses would get upset because, especially in a hospital situation, some of the doctors would come to me and ask me why. And it really pissed the others off because they were my bosses. I was just one of the lackeys. Um, so, um, so I think, he says which I don't quite agree with, but he says, if you want in your marriage or your relationship, find somebody who's already perfect the way you want them to be. But I don't think he takes into account that, and I'm sure Bobby as a psychiatrist or psychologist would understand this. We all change. And if you don't grow together, yeah, you may be perfect when you first meet, but a lot of my experience, even with friends, has been if you don't change, if you don't grow in that relationship, it dies. And that may be my assumption, but that's what I've seen, My friendship with Sally has over 20 years, but it's grown slowly. She helped me blossom. I've helped her blossom. We help each other. So I haven't lost that friendship, but other friends will start taking advantage of me and trying to use me. And I will let that happen just for so long. And then I go, nope, sorry. I had a fairly good friend who started flirting with my husband. That was the end of our relationship. You don't flirt with somebody else's husband. Even when I was single, that was a rule I never broke. I did not mess with somebody else's husband. That's her problem, not mine. So I think, I think relationships do change. We do make a lot of assumptions about ourselves. And it's complicated. Yeah, he says we shouldn't need to justify love. It's there or it isn't, which is true. Real love is accepting the other people the way they are without trying to change them. And that's a friendship kind of love too, I think. If we try to change them, this means we really don't like them. And how often do we think about that? Of course, if you decide to live with someone, if you make that agreement, it's always better to make an agreement with someone who is exactly the way you want him or her to be. Find someone you don't have to change at all. It's much easier because you don't spend a lot of time trying to change the other person. But I think we all know people only change when they choose to, and they don't change for anybody else. They only change for themselves.
I like your fur baby, Caitlin.
I like the tail anyway. And he says, so you don't have to present a false image. You've got the right to say, if you love me the way I am, fine, take me. If you don't, bye-bye. And that's really hard for someone who's attached to someone. But again, my generation in particular, we were always brought up with people who tried to change us. Our parents wanted us in a mold, and you always paid a price if you stepped outside that mold. What did pay prices? Again, he said he puts a stress on communicating, and I think a lot of couples don't communicate. I think that's why there's so much divorce. If you're clear with your communications, and B's class is all about being clear with your communications, you won't make any assumptions. Your partner will know exactly what you want because you make it perfectly clear. I want this. I want that. I don't want that. I think we make assumptions like after 25 years, you have a tendency to say, Well, he should know that I only want one rose instead of a bunch of roses. But he doesn't know that because I never told him. So, if I don't tell him, why am I going to get mad at him for not doing what he should know I want? Because in spite of being a psychic, I am not a mind reader, so I don't know what he wants either. So, and if you're married to a clam, that's very tough because you've got to have a very sharp knife to get that clam open and get it talking to you. We got background noise.
It's Charlie.
Oh, okay.
I'll mute them.
Okay. So he says the third agreement, don't make assumptions. It sounds easy. It's difficult because we so often do exactly the opposite. We all have habits and routines that we're not even aware of. So how can we expect somebody else to be aware of them? Becoming aware of our own habits and then becoming aware of the other person's habits, especially if you live together, is probably one of the first steps to getting this agreement done. What really makes a difference, he said, talking about it's fun thing, but what really makes a difference is action, doing it. Taking action over and over again strengthens your will, nurtures the seeds, and establishes a solid foundation for new growth. Isn't there a psychological tenet that says people have to hear things 3 times before they really hear them? Bobby's taking a nap. Okay. I think that's what they say. That's what I learned in psych. Yeah, if you don't repeat it at least 3 times, they don't get it. And people with hearing loss often misinterpret what somebody's saying, and it's embarrassing to keep saying, what, but either get hearing aids or say what, because otherwise you're never going to really understand what's going on, especially when there's a lot of noise around, when there's people around. That's why Matt finally got hearing aids, because we couldn't even be in the same room and he couldn't hear me. So I said, listen, you got to fix this because this is making me crazy. But that's my communication. Okay.
Her hair cut short, didn't she?
Yeah.
Okay. After many repetitions, these new agreements will become second nature. You'll see how the magic of your word transforms you from a black magician to a white magician. A white magician uses words for creation, giving, bless you, sharing, loving. By making this one agreement a habit, your whole life will be completely transformed. When you transform your whole dream, magic just happens in your life. What you need comes to you easily because spirit moves freely through you, which is really true. And I want you all to think about some examples of that you can share. This is the mastery of intent, the mastery of spirit, the mastery of love, the mastery of gratitude, and the mastery of life. This is the goal of the Toltec. It's the path to personal freedom. So think about how communication has helped make your life better, magic, and come up with some examples, if you will. I ain't doing this alone today. And don't everybody talk at once. Caitlin, you look like you want to say something. There you go.
Yes,
Go, girl.
There. I actually find, okay, so communication is very important, obviously. I find in my later years, because I embrace the importance of articulation and communicating very succinctly, that it's very frustrating to work so hard to communicate as clearly as I can, only to have other people's filter hear things the way that they need to hear them and take things out of context or not hear something at all. So that gets very frustrating. But then the 4 agreements come into play, because then I revert back to don't take things personally and just keep trying to repeat myself or communicate in such a way until I'm heard.
Great, thank you. Does that work?
For my peace of mind, it does, because, you know, my happiness is an inside job. It's never outside of me. So so yes, it does work as long as I'm using it for myself. I still cannot control, no matter how I try to speak clearly in my communication, I still can't control how the other person receives it.
Right, and we never can, because they're all about them. Great one. Anybody else? Come on, I know you all got one in there.
I find that if you bring something up that's kind of the elephant in the room that people are just nervous about addressing, but you move through it, that the relationship gets much closer because you can finally safely say these words and get through it, as opposed to worrying about annoying somebody or being judged.
Great one. I like that one.
Yeah.
So true. Yeah. Yeah, those elephants in the room are tough.
It's true. But there's a liberation once it's over, right?
I have a client that's in the process of getting hearing aids, and I can't tell you how totally shut off from life he's become due to his inability to hear you. You know what I mean? It's like, even with sign language, he has a really hard time because he just can't hear you. So my prayer for this poor man is when he does get his hearing aids, that, you know, life will turn back on for him, and unless this is just his time to shut off, you know?
And when a person has dementia and can't hear, it's twice as frustrating for them. And that's when people get hit and get hurt
Mhm.
because they misinterpret because of the dementia, but then the hearing adds to that, and it's really really scary in a dementia unit. That's why I've
You
always
totally, you defined him right there. Totally.
Yeah.
Dementia. Yeah.
yeah. So, you know, my voice has always been 4 octaves higher than everybody, so everybody could hear me. And it's also lowered
Mhm.
itself. I used to be a soprano, now I'm a bass, but they can hear the lower
Mhm.
levels of voice much better. So it was probably a purposeful thing. I just noticed it. But yeah,
Mhm.
that does help them. But yeah, the isolation when you can't hear. And I think it's almost as bad
Very, very
in
difficult.
the isolation when you don't want to hear, because a lot of people
Mhm.
don't want to hear what you have to say,
Okay. Mm-hmm.
and that's almost more dangerous, I think, because they don't have an excuse. Well, they think they do, but they don't.
Right.
So
We
you
just
know, I
have to
like
remind
Caitlin's.
ourselves.
I
We all
can't
think.
fix them. I don't take it personal, but it still bugs me. And B, you must have a lot of examples from your classes. Can you share some? Oh,
Sorry.
turn off your sound. Try again, B.
Is that better?
Yep.
Yeah.
There you go.
All
There you
right.
are.
I'm distracted by all this. What was the examples of what again?
So clearly communicating so people will actually hear what you're trying to say and get it, but then we have no control over whether they choose to get it or not. So with
Yeah.
your program, a lot of that, you taught us a lot of that.
Yeah. I think rather than say an example, I like to, it's bringing to mind like one of the things to do to help alleviate that is reflective listening. So, you know, to help try and avoid that, like saying, I heard you say this, or You know, if someone says a reply that indicates that maybe they didn't hear, like taking a moment to like clarify, oh, maybe I was misinterpreted. This was what I actually intended to say. That's what comes to my mind when we're talking about that, like how to help it, right?
Right. Rather than
Yeah.
get both feet in it. That's great. I love that. Thank you. I knew you'd have something. What about you, Kev?
Everything we've mentioned requires an assumption. I assume you heard what I said. You assume I heard what you said. And that's where we need to clarify word one. You've got to know exactly where I stand, whether you like it or not, and I'm not going to assume that you like it. And those assumptions we have to try and set aside. Did you really say that? Did I, this is what I really was saying, and remove assumption from it. Assumption is, making a butt of you and me, so, and also when we throw assumptions into a conversation, sometimes assumption is borrowing trouble, and you assume the worst, and don't often give the benefit of the doubt, but we're so quick to assume the worst because it's got to be somebody's fault, and Lord knows it's not mine. And that's where we have to be really careful that people aren't assuming what I'm saying. I'm not assuming what they're saying, and I'm not assuming their motives, and hopefully they are not assuming my motives. And that's where we all have to be really extra careful. As far as I'm concerned, I don't know. I may be all wet, but that's what works for me.
Great. Thanks. Well, in the beginning, he says the problem with, we have a tendency to make assumptions about everything because we are human. The problem with making assumptions that we believe they are the truth. We could swear they were real. We make assumptions about what others are doing or thinking. We take it personally, and then we blame them and react by sending emotional poison with our word. That's why whenever we make assumptions, like Kevin just said, we're asking for problems, we're asking for trouble. We make assumptions, we misunderstand, we take it personally, and we end up creating a whole big drama for nothing. And how often does that happen in our lives? Think about most of the drama that happened in your life. Again, even divorce. It was an assumption that this person would change because they love me. And then I get very hurt and disappointed when I find out he doesn't really care to change, or she doesn't really care to change. Whether they love me or not doesn't really matter. They're not going to change for me. So then everybody gets mad and it ends up in a nasty divorce and costing everybody all kinds of money. And the lawyers are the only ones that make out in that. Nobody else does, unless of course you're a celebrity and you can get millions. The big matote in human mind creates a lot of chaos, which causes us to misinterpret everything and misunderstand everything. We only see what we want to see and hear what we want to hear. We don't perceive things the way they are. We have a habit of dreaming with no basis in reality. And we literally dream things up in our imaginations because we don't understand something. We make assumptions. And then the truth comes out, the bubble of our dream pops, and we find out it was not what we thought it was at all. And he's got a kind of a weird little example. You're walking in the mall and you see a person you like. That person turns to you and smiles and then walks away. You make a lot of assumptions just because of this one experience. With these assumptions, you can create a whole new fantasy. You really want to believe this fantasy and you want to make it real. A whole dream begins to form just because of your assumptions. And you believe, oh, this person really likes me. Can you do that from just a smile? I don't know. It never worked for me. In your mind, a whole relationship begins from that. And maybe you even get married in a fantasy land, but the fantasy is only in your mind. It's your personal dream. And I thought that was I love that one. It was like, okay. Mm. And back to a lot of older couples do assume that sometimes you really do know what the other person wants because you've talked about it over the years, but you really can't read each other's minds. And what I want for me changes. Fortunately for me, I got a guy who will go along with that. I mean, I have done herbal stuff. I have one room full of herbal stuff. I have another room full of jewelry stuff. Now I got paint stuff. And I'm very fortunate in my relationship that he just goes along with that and says, whatever
Hello.
creative thing you want to do it.
Yes to both.
What's going on? Okay. Who's on the phone? Somebody talking on the phone? No? Okay. Sorry. And I don't know how many of you have had relationships like that. I mean, that they're very precious. He's very precious. Do we fight? Yeah, but not often. Because we both know how detrimental that is to a relationship. So we pick our battles. And again, I think in a good relationship, you try not to take things personally because you know how much that can hurt. So you sort of let some things slide. But if it really hurts, you talk about it. Sometimes it takes us days to talk about it. But we still talk about it. And it's usually me that will bring it up and say, we really need to talk about this because this is bugging me. But how hard is that to do with somebody that you love? But then again, how hard is it if you don't do that with somebody you love? You could lose that person. That's my assumption. You could lose that person. And I'm not about to lose a good person in my life because I want to be stupid today. I don't know how anybody else feels about that, but come on. Miss Dolly, you are frozen. Oh, there she is. She opened her eyes. Okay. Can you share anything today? Are you up for that? You're muted.
I'm just listening.
It's okay. You can just continue to listen. Maybe Miss Bobby has some wisdom for us. I'm sure she dealt with this in her career.
I was going to make a suggestion for communication. I don't know who else is familiar with Marshall Rosenberg's nonviolent communication.
I've heard of it.
I highly recommend it. It's a wonderful book about how to communicate in a way that creates a win-win, where the other person, it's very empathetic, and it addresses what Kevin said about it really eliminates. Well, first of all, it speaks to what B said about speak in the I. I own my statements. I own my life. I own my experiences. So instead of saying you, I just say, I heard this or I feel this based on what I heard. Is this what you said? And then seek to understand by asking a question. And it removes a whole lot of the assumptions, and you don't have to work as hard because I honor myself, express myself, and then I ask the other person what they heard or vice versa. And I have found that to be a game changer in my life for dealing with angry people. So That's the book I would recommend, is Marshall Rosenberg's
Rosenberg,
Nonviolent Communication.
thank you. Maybe someday we can have a Sunday service about that. Would be an interesting subject to explore. Bobby, what have you got to share with us about not making assumptions? I'm sure you've dealt with that a lot. You have to unmute. Is Charlie there? He's got to unmute you, hun. Where is he? Charlie, can you unmute, Charlie? Thank you. So we can hear your lovely wife.
Can you hear me now?
Yes,
Yep.
thank you.
Okay. So you were talking about making assumptions. It's virtually impossible not to make assumptions. But it's even though we do make assumptions, this was already covered earlier when somebody said, the only way you really know for sure is to check it out. What I thought I heard, correct me if I'm wrong, but what I understood is you said thus and so, and ask for clarification. Now you may or may not get it. The person may be not willing to totally confront. And by the way, the word confront simply means face to face. It doesn't mean negative. C-O-N is with, and front is face. So it's face to face. So people assume that confrontation means altercation or could lead to altercation. But sometimes confrontation is the only way not to have an altercation, is by talking it through.
Great.
So,
Yeah.
first of all, I think it's impossible not to make assumptions. I think even though it's impossible not to make them, I think it's equally very important to check out what I assume I have heard. And then I have to take them at their word. If they say, no, I didn't mean that. And then I can say, well, do you mind clarifying? What did you mean? Because here's what I thought I heard. And some people can also use that as a weapon by saying, well, you misconstrued that. You didn't hear me right. And whenever we hear the word you, we all kind of pull back because we hear that as being accusatory, whether it is or not. We hear it that way. So I think the importance of clarification cannot be overstated. That's the only way we'll ever know if that's a person's intent or not. And perhaps sometimes the person doesn't even realize that they did it because it was not terribly conscious on their part of how they did handle the situation. So they may be trying to walk around the so-called elephant in the room and not address it, but eventually the truth comes out. So I think the idea about never making assumptions is, number one, impossible. We're always going to make assumptions. Number two, clarify what we think we have heard. And then number three, probably more importantly, when they tell you, here's what I meant, then take it as face value. Later on, if that's not what they meant, you'll find out.
Good point. Yeah, you do find
Mhm.
out. Yeah. The
Yeah.
truth
True.
comes, and
Mhm.
you're right, there are people, and I've met several of them, who will use that as a weapon because they will say, no, you're crazy. I didn't say that. I didn't say that was black. I said it was white. When they said it was white, but they will do that just so you lose and they win. Has that been your experience too?
Yeah, and if you're in that tug of war with somebody over pulling a rope back and forth, that's never going to be a win-win or partial win for anybody.
Right.
At that point, there comes a time when you just put up your hands and say, I think we have to really come to the point of agreeing not to agree.
Yeah.
We're not going to see eye to eye on this, and that's the way life is. We don't always have to agree with everything.
True.
So I think there's a time to call it and say, we're simply not going to agree upon this.
Well, one of the things we used to do with the doctors who would get obstreperous, we would just look at them very sweetly. Right about that.
I missed that. Say it again.
I said, we used to say to them, oh, you could be right about that. Didn't tell them they were right. Didn't tell them they were wrong, but
you
they,
can certainly make some neutralizing statement.
right. Yeah.
That could very well be so.
Yeah. They went
Exactly.
away
Really could
smiling.
be.
Yeah. You could be right.
Yeah.
That worked because MDs have huge egos and, you're just a
yeah.
little piddling nurse and what do you know?
Yeah.
So, but there are other people in other businesses do the same thing. So, I was taught by a psych nurse to say that you could be right about that and just kind of walk away and let them think about it. So,
Yeah,
but yeah, I think you're right. I think we do make assumptions. I don't think we realize it.
I think it's automatic. I think making assumptions is all part of sorting through what we're hearing and trying to respond to what we need to respond to.
Mhm.
And we'll all pick something out a little different to respond to based upon our own past experiences.
Good one. Yeah. Yeah.
Okay.
So
I have a question. If I'm saying, as far as my client's concerned, in regards to his hearing, am I saying it because I'm assuming it, or am I speaking of it because of experience with hearing loss and dementia? You know what I mean? Or is it still an assumption?
Well, there's not much you can do about the hearing loss if the individual is not amenable to wearing a hearing aid.
Well, he's in the process of getting hearing aids, but what my point is it's not really an assumption. It's a fact that, he has hearing loss and his communication is not where it should be because of the inability to hear. That really affects daily living, as you can imagine.
Well, then I think that,
So, but is that an assumption?
I think that must be addressed verbally out loud.
Mm-hmm.
And say, what I'm hearing you say, and again, you just simply state what you've heard and check it out and say, is that your intention? Was that your intention? How do you feel about whatever the topic is?
It's very hard to even have that discussion with even short words because of his hearing situation now. So hopefully after his hearing aids come, it'll be better. But I was just thinking in my head, is that an assumption on my part, or is that just the reality of what is with him?
Well, that's what I say. Assumptions they're automatic. We assess situations, and based upon our assumptions,
right,
we make assumptions.
Right.
I think it's
Through
impossible. I think it's impossible not to assume. It doesn't mean the assumptions are right or wrong. It just means we have to assess it and say, what does this mean to me? And then check it out with them. Was this your intent?
Is this what you said?
Got you.
Can I
Sorry.
make, I
Yeah.
would, have any of you ever taken the unfair hearing test?
No.
A
The
roommate of mine,
unfair hearings.
unfair hearing test.
What is
A roommate of mine
what is
was
that?
principal at a deaf school. I'm just about to describe it. And what it was to teach you what you're dealing with when you're dealing with someone who has impaired hearing. And what the test is, you hear 10 words, and they're the same 10 words, but each time they give you the words, it's a different impairment level. So you hear a word number 1, and by the time you get to word number 10, like you're thinking, have I heard that? But all that does, a lot of the time, when we're getting hearing aids, all hearing aids do is aggravate the distortion that we're hearing. A lot of the time, if we're having difficulty with someone understanding the word, switch words. Because you may be saying flower, but they can't understand flower. But if you, I don't know, petunia or whatever you want to pick a different word, and they may be able to understand that word because that word may not be distorted in their hearing abilities.
So it's really not the
Hmm.
hearing.
Well, thank you for that. And that's
It's not the
interesting.
hearing, really. It's the understanding.
Yeah, and it's how the brain
Right.
processes it, you
Uh-huh.
know, and sometimes if you just, and I used to do with my mother who had dementia at the time, and I would try to get a point across and she wasn't understanding. I would switch out the word and she would then be able to understand it.
Mhm.
So I saw it. And around the deaf school, when you were dealing with students and they had partial hearing, it was the same thing. If they didn't understand basketball, maybe they'd understand hoops. Who knows? You know,
Hmm.
and it's that simple because 90% of the time, hearing aids, all they're doing is making the distortion louder,
Mhm.
which leaves them just as confused.
I'd like to jump in here since I've had a loss of hearing for a long time. And so I can speak with a lot of experience. But when I hear people say, well, should, when I use the word should, they should hear better. That's an assumption, right? We're making, every time we use the word should, we're making an assumption. And oftentimes the assumptions aren't correct. Now, I make assumptions. As an optimist, I make assumptions that things will get better. As a pessimist, I make an assumption that things will get worse. When I buy a stock, I make an assumption that it will go up. So we all, like Bobby says, we all make assumptions. Now, regarding hearing, it changes a lot in your life because there's sometimes I think I hear something and it's a different word, so I make up my own scenario of what I'm hearing, and it's not even close to being correct. And when I first got a hearing aid, and it's even true today, you know, Bobby will make assumptions I can hear her speak or call me from another room, and I don't. And there's uh, sometimes what happens is she says something, um, and she makes an assumption that I've understood what she said, And there's sometimes that I'll respond that, I didn't hear it. Well, I heard sound, but I mean, when I said I didn't hear it, I really mean I don't understand what you're saying, because I did hear something. And that's very prevalent in my life. I noticed that if I fail to have my hearing aid in, my life's quieter. I don't have to put up with so much noise. Now, in tennis, when I play tennis, hearing is a big part of tennis. You got to listen to the ball. That's a big part of playing tennis. And if you don't hear it, you don't play as well. So, when I first got hearing aids, oh my God, when I put it in, I could hear conversation a block away, people speaking on a cell phone. I didn't want to hear it. I was used to be not hearing it. It was awful. So it is really a dilemma because all the hearing aid does is amplify. It amplifies the sounds that you're able to hear, but it can't amplify the sounds that aren't there. You've
Well,
lost.
it can't amplify the meaning of the sound.
It
It
mean-
amplifies the sound.
Yeah, it amplifies the sound.
But all that does is restate or repeat what's already been said before or played before.
Yeah, but it's unable to amplify the sounds where I've lost that ability and those decibels. And
Right.
so it just amplifies sound.
So I think that we're talking there about the difference between quote unquote normal in quotes and hard of hearing. If you are the range of, classified as hard of hearing or hearing impaired, that's very different from having quote unquote normal within the normal hearing range. So we have to adjust ourselves. I mean, if a person were blind, I wouldn't give them a lot of visuals. If I know they can't see it, what's the point? Same thing is true of a person with a hearing impairment. No matter how many times I say it or restate it, they're still not going to hear or understand the meaning of what they're hearing.
Right.
Anyway, that's a lot about hearing aids. I have one question, since we are a spiritual community. What assumptions do we make about God?
That he's always listening.
That God's always listening. What other assumptions?
That God is.
She is.
Is there a God?
My big assumption is everybody thinks like me.
Exactly.
And I don't mean to, I know when I start talking sometime, I hear this when I'm editing the tapes, and I'm going, oh my God, you got on a little soapbox there. And I'm assuming that everyone thinks the same way I do, and I really hope that they don't think that, but that's an assumption I have to be careful of. I always have to kind of say, well, not everybody agrees with me or whatever, allow for individual spirituality. We all don't think the same.
Absolutely. And that's you said it right there, Kevin. We don't, because we're all different. We're all, individuals. We can be like-minded, but you're right. We all think differently.
And we think differently on different times and different dates, depending upon what's going on our own emotional lives.
Yeah.
Absolutely.
If I'm emotionally fragile about something, I'm much more defensive. If I'm relaxed and open, that's different.
Right. And when you're defensive, you're much more quick to assume a negative, I would think,
Absolutely.
you know?
Mm.
Because I'm
Yeah.
friends.
And in a long-term relationship, I wish I could tell the difference that when she's fragile and not fragile.
Oh, you'll
But she'll let me know right away if,
Yeah.
yeah.
I have no doubt.
There's no
doubt.
mystery.
There's no mystery. But back
One of
again
the,
about God, when assumptions we make about God, and when I find myself like praying to a deity, I have to also recognize that if I'm an individualization of the deity or the thing itself or this thing we call God, then I'm speaking as God and I'm listening as God. So when um, I don't want to separate myself from God. So if I think I'm just speaking to something out there that I'm not a part of, and I'm waiting for an answer from that mysterious thing out there, I may wait forever. But if the answer comes to my mind intellectually or intuitively, where's that come from? What's the assumption there?
The assumption is there's more to it than what we think.
Yeah.
Yeah, good.
and there's
Good.
more to it than what we know
Yeah.
that we won't know till we get there.
The minute we die, we are instantly imbued with all this knowledge. I mean, I can't wait.
When I've studied the saints and sages, one thing that's remarkable is that their experience of deity or God or the thing itself is all unique to them. And the way they react and respond and lead their lives is an individual experience. It's like, it's all different, yet there's a similarity in it all that binds us together in a deeper understanding, I guess.
Bee's had her hand up. What you got to say, Bee?
What's that, Nikki?
Bee,
Well, on this whole thread of like not making assumptions and like from a lot of different threads in this, one of the things that it made me think of is that sometimes I've heard stuff and then I'm by myself and I'm kind of ruminating on what I've heard. And I have to realize that like the person could have meant like A, B, or C. And I don't know because they're not there to ask at the moment, or they're not willing to engage for me to ask. And so that's always one of those times where I try and practice, okay, out of A, B, and C, what matches with they're doing their best at the moment too. And I try and like go with that if I can, if I feel like I can trust that from them. Just wanted to share that as like
Mhm.
a kind of a practice that I do when communication isn't perfect and you're not able to get that clarification. So just sharing that.
It's great. It's a good idea.
I want to say just, a reminder for me is, we're all spiritual beings here traveling this thing called life on earth. And it's not easy. It's hard. It's can be easy sometimes, or it can be very hard sometimes. But you know what? We get up, we show up, and we put one foot in front of the other, and we do the best that we can. And that's all that we can do with that word assumption.
I think you're absolutely right.
I assume you're right.
I thought I'd get a chuckle out of you. Come on.
Yeah, it
Oh,
also
this has
reminds me
been-
of meeting people where they're at. So you can't assume anything.
Mm-hmm.
They, like Bee was saying,
Mhm.
what are they doing that's their highest and best?
Yep. It's like when we meet someone that is like into Reiki or Tibetan bowls or spiritual stuff like we are, how excited and our eyes open up and we really listen. Why? Because there's that connectedness, you know? You know what I mean? You know how it is when you've met people that are like-minded like we are. It feels good. Yeah. A good assumption.
And then sometimes I have to remind myself on the flip side that there are people that I can't tell that are just going to lie for various reasons. And I have to, while trying to assume the best, like, know that I can't know for sure. So whenever I can't do that communication, I try and assume the best, but then I just let myself rest saying, I really don't know. And there's nothing I can do to clear it up right now. And that kind of helps me let it go too.
Mm-hmm.
Carry a big box of salt.
And we can't know everything. We'd be crazy if we knew everything, right?
Yeah, probably.
Or bored.
True, too.
Yeah, I want to learn. I don't want to know everything. I want something to learn.
Mm.
That's what keeps me going, kind of thing, is the progression, not the I don't want to ever feel like I know it all.
That's why you chose to
Mhm.
come back as human, imperfect as we are.
Mm-hmm.
We're here to learn
Right.
lessons.
Warts and all.
What's the law? Yeah.
All right, we're at the top of the hour. You
Great. Thank you, everyone. That was wonderful.
Yes, it was. Good to see everyone.
Nick, do you know what we're doing next week?
we don't have a speaker for next week, so we're open.
Okay.
Could either do the fourth agreement or somebody else.
Fourth agreement.
I'll try. My niece's showers next Saturday night, so but I'll try. I'll put it on my agenda. Excuse me? Fourth
What
agreement
is-
is always do your best.
Well, we
That
can
should
talk
be an
about that.
that should be an easy one to talk about. Yeah. All right,
Well,
let's
it'll be
put that on there.
interesting too. It's to see how we all define your best.
Very good.
Is my
Okay.
best.
Everybody think about that for the week.
All righty.
I
Do your
years
best
ago I
and
had a keynote address that I gave a lot of places, and I called it "Making the Most of Your Best," which
Ooh,
was kind of
Wow.
innocuous. It didn't really mean
There you
anything.
go, Bobby. We know what
It
you're
was
doing
catchy.
next week.
yeah, right. We know where you're gonna be next week. Great.
Thank you
Have a
all.
We just
wonderful week, everyone.
nominated you, Bobby.
Yeah, right.
Okay, that's
I'll
fine.
read it. You talk about it. Got it.
And we assume you're gonna do it.
We assume
right.
you're gonna do it.
We assume you'll show up.
Right.
Have a great week, everybody.
Great week.
Bye-bye.
Bye.
You.
Love you all. Bye-bye.
You too.